David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
Let's talk about race baiting today. Race baiting is a term that it's thrown around a lot. The left sometimes uses it. The right really likes to use it. Usually they use it in different situations. It's not always totally clear what it means. So just to get it out of the way so we don't even think for a second that this is what we mean, race baiting isn't just saying racist things, right? Sometimes it is saying things about certain racial groups. But it's more complicated than that. And it dates back, according to Merriam-Webster, to the early 1960s. That was the civil rights era. So that helps us sort of understand more about the context of this term, race baiting. And what the right likes to say is that race baiting is when you make false accusations of discrimination on the basis of race to try to influence people into thinking that something is racist. And of course, the goal of that would be that they would take some action, or that they would vote a certain way, or that they would protest or whatever. Now, that's kind of hard to understand just by defining it in that way. So let's think through an example. One example would be in one of these cases of a police officer shooting a black man, and there have been a number of these cases, prominent ones over the last many years. People will sometimes point out that race may have been or was a factor in how the police officer treated the black man that they shot. The idea being, well, if everything was the same but the suspect was white, maybe the police officer wouldn't have shot them, or the black man wouldn't have ended up dead. That type of conversation. And what the right will often say is that's race baiting. You're making people think that the police are acting on the basis of race, when in fact they aren't, or it hasn't been demonstrated that they're acting on the basis of race when they shoot a particular black man. We're more in the world of media than policy, and in media, race baiting is also a term that's used. And when media are accused of race baiting, again, this is all according to the right, they are supposedly making a story about race or racism in order either to get attention or to garner ratings or to be salacious or whatever, when, according to those who allege that race baiting is going on, the story shouldn't really be about race. And sometimes race baiting can be sort of a gray area in terms of it being overlapping with concern trolling. Concern trolling is when you disingenuously express concern about something to derail genuine discussion about it. So is race baiting a real thing? Yes, it's a real thing. It exists both theoretically and in practice. There are real examples of race baiting. But the problem is that calling something race baiting has become the same as calling someone an SJW when they're making an argument, or saying someone is a regressive leftist when they're discussing an issue or talking about policy. When regressive leftist first became a thing, and we have been covering the term regressive leftist for a while, it at least conceivably was about something specific, right? People ostensibly or supposedly on the left who were taking non-left positions. That was initially at least what regressive leftist was supposed to point out. But it very quickly was bastardized or perverted by the right, and it became kind of like a catch-all insult that the right uses on the left. SJW, social justice warrior. In principle, fighting for social justice is a good thing, but the term social justice warrior has become a way to not have real debate about issues by framing others as irrationally for this amorphous concept of social justice. And in the exact same way that regressive leftist has been perverted, in the same way that being someone who fights for social justice has been a term perverted by the right now uses the term race baiting to just dismiss criticism about or related to racial discrimination. And it's a way to actually try to discredit the person making the argument. We need to talk about the way that police treat young black men in this country, in this city or wherever. That's race baiting. That is a way that you rile people up, and that is not actually the issue. This is what those who claim race baiting would say. That's not an argument. Using race baiting in that way is not a way to figure out, is there actually a problem involving the police and race that we should be solving? It ends debate. And similarly, the term cultural Marxism, or cultural Marxists as a term, has been used similar to race baiting, in that almost no one who has good faith discussions about our economy or about race uses those terms. What I mean is people on the left who want to explore the ways in which capitalism has failed us versus ways in which maybe capitalism works and talk about how society should be organized for maximum well-being, they never say we come from a cultural Marxist perspective. They don't identify as cultural Marxists, with very few exceptions. It's a term that the right uses about the left. And in the same way, people who have serious conversations about race relations or discrimination and other racial issues, they don't talk about race baiting, they're talking about race. Now, there are some exceptions where race baiting has really taken place. They don't accuse each other of race baiting as part of their debate, but we talk about the fact that race baiting has sometimes taken place. So here's an example. When Barack Obama, when he was president, he, on a podcast, I think it was the Mark Maron podcast, but I don't remember exactly, he used the N-word. And corporate media became filled with discussions and debates about whether it's okay for Obama to use the N-word. CNN had a segment about it. Fox News had a segment about it. Is it okay for President Obama to use the N-word? Right-wingers said it was race baiting to use the N-word. The real discussion should have been, well, what's the issue that President Obama was addressing via his use of the N-word? That's actually the important issue. But instead, it became a conversation over, ooh, Obama used the N-word. Is that okay or is that not okay? Real race baiting is embodied when George H.W. Bush put out a campaign ad in 1986 against Michael Dukakis, his Democratic opponent, which attacked Michael Dukakis for letting some people out of prison, including a black guy named Willie Horton, okay? That was race baiting. It was an ad which showed a black guy and talked about prison furloughs, which instills racial fear based on stereotypes about dangerous black men. That's not what the right is criticizing when they say race baiting. That was actual race baiting. So bottom line, like regressive leftists, like irrationally politically correct SJWs, race baiting exists, but mostly it's this sloppy, sort of lazy way of ending or stifling discussion, which supposedly the new free speech warrior movement on the right wants to have. They claim to want to have discussion about issues. Don't fall for it, okay? Claiming something is race baiting is not an argument. Don't allow it to count as an argument. And most importantly, don't be intimidated out of having a debate and expressing your views because someone accuses you of race baiting. The right often likes to say, I'm offended isn't an argument. It's a way to stop real conversation. Well, in the same way, saying that's race baiting also isn't an argument, and it's being used as a way to stop conversation, and we shouldn't allow it to be done. Speaking of race and race baiting and racism, there was an attempt at a follow-up white nationalist alt-right rally yesterday in Washington, D.C. You might remember a year ago in Charlottesville, Virginia, there was a horrible, horrible white supremacist, white separatist alt-right rally. It led to the death of Heather Heyer. I always say that incorrectly.
It's Heyer?
It is Heyer. I just never remember what it is. The current president of the United States said that there were very fine people on both sides of that white nationalist, white supremacist alt-right rally in Charlottesville, Virginia a year ago. We're now at the 1-year anniversary. And of course, this is exactly the type of event we would remember with a moment of silence, not another white nationalist rally, but there were white nationalists who wanted another rally. So they were going to do it this weekend. They were going to do it Sunday. And in terms of turnout, it failed hilariously and miserably. Apparently, somewhere between a couple dozen and 50 actual alt-right white nationalist supporters showed up. There were way more counter-protesters and police officers and even just media people covering it, way outnumbering the actual white nationalist alt-rightists. And I want to sort of make the point that just because there was low turnout at this event doesn't mean that there's no longer white supremacy that has been reinvigorated by the presidency of Donald Trump. It doesn't mean that there's no longer horrible, vile people in this country. They didn't show up to the rally, but that doesn't mean that they don't exist. And of course, we know they exist, and we know that they've been emboldened by the presidency of Donald Trump. We actually had someone on the ground there, Joshua Turner, who you might remember because he's a former neo-Nazi who I've interviewed on the show. He's part of an organization called Saved by Reason, and he emailed me and he said, quote, About 50 Unite the Right guys came, and there were over 10,000 counter-protesters. The police had them separated, and everything went down peacefully. I filmed with Newsy the entire time, got to talk to some neo-Nazis one-on-one. They were happy the protest turned out peacefully, but they were basically drowned out from the counter-protesters and left early the second it started to drizzle. So it rained on their parade, literally. And that was about it. So it was a failure. It was a failure in terms of being this sort of public show of support for alt-rightism or white nationalism or whatever. I find the most interesting thing about this entire one-year anniversary rally to be how media was unsure about if and how they should cover it. Of course, right-wing media mostly provided cover for the fact that this was a white supremacist rally. So a couple of examples of that. Least Power from Media Matters had some funny lower third screenshots from Fox and Friends where they forgot to mention that it was a white nationalist rally. One lower third during Fox and Friends said, "Antifa demands an end to America." They had another headline, "Antifa protesters chant no borders in D.C." What about the fact that it was white nationalists commemorating Charlottesville where a woman died? Yeah, apparently they couldn't be expected to do that. Okay, so that was one thing, and we sort of expected that coverage from right-wing media. But the more interesting thing is that there is a debate about should we deplatform white nationalists versus should we challenge them on their ideas and interview them. This is a debate we've dealt with a lot because of my interviews with all kinds of extremists, the Westboro Baptist Church, white nationalist Richard Spencer, homophobes, racists, so on and so forth. And the debate that is had is usually the wrong debate. The debate is usually, David, these people should not be interviewed, period, or merely interviewing them exposes their bad ideas. I believe that the responsible approach is what Stephen Bennell II, also known to some of you as Destiny in the online gaming world, calls responsible platforming, which means if you interview the racists or the extremists or whoever, you have to understand it's not always obvious to the audience that their ideas are bad, racist, discriminatory ideas. They want to do the interview because they want any platform to be used to get these ideas out there, and maybe someone will be convinced by their ideas. So simply saying to them, "Tell me why you're a racist. Tell me why Jews are the problem in all of the world," whatever, and having them tell you why, that doesn't expose them. That's not responsible platforming. Responsible platforming means you're prepared to challenge their ideas, not in a screaming and yelling way. We don't yell and scream on this program, but with thoughtful, well-crafted questions where you've researched what their likely responses are going to be so that you can interrupt their use of your platform for propaganda purposes. That's what I try to do. I don't think I always succeed, Pat, at least not as well as I want to, but there's this middle ground between they should be completely deplatformed and we pretend their ideas don't exist. That doesn't work because that actually can provide cover for their ideas to catalyze and to metastasize. The other side is just interviewing them is bad for them because it exposes their bad ideas. Responsible platforming is the path forward.
Yeah, man, I think in most corporate outlets, the reporters will either try to go for the gotcha question to catch them in like some soundbite that's not going to play out well for them.
Sure.
Or they don't know which questions to ask and they don't know how to push them effectively because they're not used to asking very pressing questions. Like if they're interviewing a politician, they don't want to say something that will cause them access in the future. So it's more about practice than anything else.
Yeah, they don't want to lose access.
Yeah.
And I think that that is a big priority for how corporate media handles interviews with big politicians and bigger names. And I think that that is, it's a false debate that was mostly had around this. It's not so much about whether to interview the extremists, but about how to interview them. Interviewing them in and of itself isn't what needs to be debated. How it should be done is the important conversation, and a lot of bogus discussions centered around this rally. Send me your thoughts. How do you define responsible platforming? I'm on Twitter at dpacman, and the show is on Twitter at David Pakman Show.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
Big thank you today to William Kennedy, who's today's new member of the day. We are mostly supported by members who sign up at www.joinpacman.com. Also want to say thanks to someone who's been with us for a long time, dating all the way back to 2013, Danny Ebie Jacobson. I hope I'm pronouncing that last name correctly. Ebie Jacobson. Or maybe it's Ebi. Abe. Danny, that part I'm sure of. I really appreciate your support now going on 6 years, in fact. Thank you so much. Join William and Danny at www.joinpacman.com. Save 40% if you want using the coupon code VOTESOON18. I have for you today one of the dumbest political news cycle stories of the last 72 hours, and it has been drama between Democratic candidate for the House, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, and right-wing radio host Ben Shapiro. I know Ben. I've never had any contact with Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. And with peace and love, I'm telling you, both of their contributions to this drama have been really, really dumb. And if you haven't heard about this, I'll give you the 60-second summary. Ben Shapiro offered Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez a $10,000 donation to either the charity of her choice or to her campaign. Now, it's sort of an unusual offer, the idea of saying to a candidate for a position, I'll donate to your campaign if you debate me, but it's fine for Ben Shapiro to make that offer if he wants. The legality of the $10,000 campaign contribution, of course, appears to be not legal. The limit is $2,700, but okay, I guess it could be $2,700 to her campaign and, the rest to a charity of her choice. In any case, Alexandria didn't reply. She didn't say yes or no. She simply didn't reply, which is perfectly fine for her to do. She has no responsibility to reply to Ben Shapiro. She's running for Congress. He's a right-wing radio host. She can do whatever the hell she wants or nothing at all when she is offered a debate, period. But then Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez likened Ben Shapiro's request that she reply to catcalling on the street, as sometimes happens, as often happens, as happens all the time, all over this country and all over the world. She said on Twitter, just like catcalling, I don't owe a response to unsolicited requests from men with bad intentions. And also like catcalling, for some reason, they feel entitled to one. This is very silly, okay? She's right. She owes Ben Shapiro nothing. And she's not saying that expecting a response is the same as a catcall. She's saying expecting a response to the debate invitation is like expecting a response to catcalling. But why are we even talking about catcalling? And I made a tweet about this over the weekend, and I ended up deleting it because I got jumped all over by people on the left saying, David, have you heard of simile? Have you heard of analogy? It's not the same as catcalling. Expecting the response is similar to... I kind of regret having deleted the tweet. I reflexively did it, and I always say you really just shouldn't delete tweets. And for a second, I thought, oh man, I must have really misworded this. Let me just delete it and start over. I regret doing that now, but a lot of people saying it's not the same as... She's not saying it's the same as catcalling. Fine, but even bringing up catcalling devalues criticisms of actual catcalling that takes place. So here it's already gotten really dumb, in my opinion. But then Ben Shapiro jumps back in with something that's just as dumb, calling the mention of catcalling a slander of him, okay? He tweeted, discussions and debate are not bad intentions. Slandering someone as a sexist catcaller without reason or evidence does demonstrate cowardice and bad intent, however. Once again, slander colloquially is making false and damaging statements about someone. Slander legally is making false and damaging statements about someone that rise to the level of, I don't know, I guess you would call it civil liability in some case. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez didn't slander Shapiro or anything close to it. She didn't even say he is a catcaller or he is like a catcaller. She said the expectation of a response is like the expectation of a response that catcallers may have. It was one dumb statement after another. It became this massive story, Pat, where every media outlet jumps in. And I'm sort of glad that the timing was over the weekend so that we had the ability to let it all shake out and see the dumb comments from both sides instead of just commenting like on her catcalling comment or just commenting about the invitation, which we likely wouldn't have done. The entire thing now has put together sort of the totality of the picture. And as you can probably tell, I don't care about her not debating. I don't care about her not responding or the offer. What's interesting to me is how quickly it devolves into nonsense statements from both sides. And as far as Shapiro's concerned, how can someone with a law degree like him call it slander? It just doesn't make any sense.
I don't know. I think this whole thing is a total gong show. I don't think Ben Shapiro should have made the request in the first place.
I think it's fine.
It certainly helps him and his brand, right? And especially because Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez doesn't want to debate him because, at a time or because she feels like that's just too below her profile.
Or it doesn't
that makes him look strong, right?
Or it doesn't contribute to her winning her election in the 14th district of New York, right? Which would be a perfectly reasonable explanation for why she's not going to do it.
And if Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez really just isn't interested in debating Ben Shapiro, she could have just stayed silent on the matter, right? Not tweeted anything back at him.
And in the meantime, the hangers-on, like right-wingers Candace Owens and Charlie Kirk, they jumped in and they said, hey, we can get even more money together if she'll do it, or saying they'd debate her. And again, I ended up in the middle of this on Twitter. I said, listen, I'll debate any of these people. Nobody has to pay anybody, right? Hundreds of people saying, let's do that. Ben, please debate David, or Candace, please debate David. Not a peep from any of them. And you know what? They don't owe me a response. I'd be up for the debates, but they don't owe me a response.
Well,
That's
Ben Shapiro has been on for an interview on the topic of gun control, although it has been some time since then. And then we heard from one of Charlie Kirk's publicists, too, about getting him on, but that kind of fizzled out.
Yes, it evaporated into thin air, sort of like Donald Trump's foreign policy plan, or whatever analogy you want to make. Let's talk about Laura Ingraham. She has a show on Fox News. The program has been repulsive and revolting for a long time. That's not news. The most recent time we talked about Laura Ingraham, it was when she equated child internment camps for immigrant children to summer camps. That was about a month or two ago. But now it's been taken to a new level because Ingraham is spouting straight up white nationalism in prime time on Fox News. I've often talked about code that's used to bait people. This kind of relates to our conversation at the top of the show about race baiting. So if you have some political savvy, you don't straight up say black and brown people are horrible and are destroying our country. You speak in double entendres. You say the values we hold dear are at risk as a result of immigration from underprivileged parts of the world, right? You word it in a way where you're kind of hiding behind language. You don't say uncontrolled gun ownership is fine, except when it's black people. No, you don't say it that way. You say enforcement of gun laws must focus on low-income populations in urban areas who are obtaining guns specifically to commit crimes, right? Or again, however you want to phrase it. Laura Ingraham went on a rant about demographic changes destroying our country, and this is one of the features of the Trump era. And I call it a feature because Trumpists like this. It's now more acceptable in the milieu of the 2018 Trumpists to say straight up a lot of the things you used to feel some shame about saying, and you would hide behind ambiguity or double meanings. Here's Laura Ingraham straight up saying America no longer exists because of demographic changes as a result of both illegal and legal. Remember, they used to say that legal immigration's fine. Legal immigration is also part of why we've lost America.
Because in some parts of the country, it does seem like the America that we know and love doesn't exist anymore. Massive demographic changes have been foisted upon the American people. And they're changes that none of us ever voted for, and most of us don't like. From Virginia to California, we see stark examples of how radically, in some ways, the country has changed. Now, much of this is related to both illegal and, in some cases, legal immigration that, of course, progressives love.
So they run B-roll over her shoulder of Hispanics harvesting food. She wouldn't eat if it weren't for those illegal and legal immigrants that she claims to be so concerned about. They literally put up the B-roll that proves why these individuals are so important to the United States being the United States of America. Listen to what she's saying. America as we know it no longer exists because of demographic changes brought on by immigration. Cut the doublespeak. Demographic changes means a lower percentage of white people due to a higher percentage of non-white people. When she says because of immigration, that is saying America is no longer what it once was. It's no longer real America because there's too many brown people that have come in. The people who are single-handedly supporting her eating food and assimilating nutrition and nutrients so that she can remain alive.
Yeah, she says it doesn't seem like the America we know. Sounds kind of like an observation rather than her making a point. If she was to make a point, then she'd have to go into the statistics of, the population of white people declining. But she doesn't even want to get into that. She just wants to make it about feeling.
And the most important element of this is the word foisted. The word foisted, demographic changes have been foisted upon America. To foist is to impose something that's unwelcome, right? Most of the immigration to the U.S. has been legal in accordance with the laws of the country. When white people came from Europe and came to what is now the United States and killed endless Native Americans, that is demographic change foisted upon a population, violently so. People moving to the U.S. like they've moved to the U.S. since the beginning of the country is not the violent foisting she's trying to frame. What she's saying did happen, it just isn't over the last 20 years because of people coming from Latin America to work in the restaurant industry and in the agriculture industry, and of course, in every industry, including medicine and law and everything else. It's how the country was created. There was demographic change foisted upon the people who were already in the country, and it's called when white people came here and killed Native Americans. And by the way, I mentioned this. She mentions that both illegal and legal immigrants are part of the problem. I thought Republicans were still claiming they only are against illegal immigration. I guess she's now including both of those. And I don't know how this woman has a single sponsor left at this point. She's saying she wants a white country. She's saying the real America is a white America, and we've lost that. And apparently Fox News, I guess tacitly is okay with this. One of the top 3 cable networks in the country is not reacting to what she said. I guess they like it.
Yeah, and also Laura Ingraham does have 3 adopted children from foreign countries.
Oh,
one from Russia, 2 from Russia, and 1 from Guatemala. Mm-hmm. I wonder how they would feel about this comment.
I'm sure, unfortunately, I'm sure that they are completely brainwashed by Laura Ingraham. If they're even old enough to be, I have no idea about any of these individuals. But, making the argument that she couldn't possibly be racist because she has a Hispanic daughter or son, that's called identity politics, and I thought that they were against that. So I'd be curious to see whether she makes that argument. Discuss this with us on our Reddit discussion forum, davidpakman.com/REDVIT.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. Welcome back to the David Pakman Show.
It's great to be joined today by Carl Zimmer, who's a columnist for the New York Times, also author most recently of She Has Her Mother's Laugh, The Power, Perversions, and Potential of Heredity. Carl, it's so great to talk to you. We've been following the development of genetic editing technology, CRISPR. We've had medical ethicists on the program to discuss the issue. I guess to kind of get us started in this conversation, has the discussion around genetic editing in humans changed fundamentally over the last 5, 10, or 15 years as a result of the technology that has advanced? Or is the debate and controversy around it basically the same one that's been around for a couple of decades?
I think that the debate is getting more realistic in the sense that that people are actually able to point to particular kinds of technologies and say, we could actually use this and make particular changes to the human genome. Before, a lot of it was quite hypothetical, almost science fiction, but now there are experiments going on where scientists appear to be able to make precise changes to human embryos. They can do it. So the debate has gotten more realistic. It's also gotten more urgent because this is going to happen quickly.
One of the, I guess I'd call it an argument or talking points that you will often read in opposition to this type of technology is that it's going to lead to rich people being able to afford designer babies. It could lead to even a larger gap in terms of wealth and income over the long term, because you're going to have rich people who are going to be able to, et cetera, et cetera. I think you understand the argument. Is that the actual concern that should be debated, or is that sort of a false debate in your mind?
I think that it's not really getting at the heart of the technology in terms of a debate. That is really a question about how we hand out medical services, really. What if we lived in a country where anybody could use CRISPR on their child, say through some kind of socialized medicine system? Suddenly that debate goes away. But, I don't think that people would say, oh, okay, it's all settled then. I think there are more fundamental issues about CRISPR that really feel, deeply uncomfortable to a lot of people. Just the mere fact of being able to change the future of heredity. And we should explore that. Why is that so unsettling to us? And are we right to feel that way? Or maybe we should just learn to like it.
One of the primary ways that Arthur Caplan sort of said or suggested that we should divide genetic edits into categories was the type that would persist to the children of those who have had the modifications done, and those that would not. In other words, those that would not be passed along. In your mind, is that a reasonable way to sort of categorize the types of edits that could conceivably be done?
I think that's a good first pass, because, the fact is that scientists have been developing ways to treat genetic disorders for decades. And we're really on the verge of starting to have really effective treatments that actually change the genes themselves. But we're talking here about, a person who is born with a disease and then at some point later they get a treatment. So maybe in the future, people could get, say, a treatment for hemophilia, where you either insert a working copy of that blood clotting gene into their cells, or maybe you go in with gene editing technology like CRISPR and you change it. But they won't pass that down to the next generation. If you change the embryo and fix that change, then you are talking about things that are going to be inherited in the next generation. And so if there's any concerns about safety, it's not just that one patient you're thinking about. You have to think about the person who inherits those genes from that patient.
One of the things I think about in this discussion, but really in any discussion about technology, is that the argument that the technology could be misused or used in ways that would not be in line to maybe maximize well-being or whatever standard you want to apply to it, that type of argument has sort of also been around, right? I mean, if you go back to like a crude example where the automobile became something that was clearly on the horizon, there was the argument made that it would have this bad side effect of the horse buggy drivers are going to lose their job. And obviously when we get more distance from that, a fork in the road, so to speak, we realize it was silly to ever think that that was going to be an argument to hold back the development of the car. Are you swayed in general by arguments about how a technology could be misused, or is that just inherent to anything that humans develop?
It's interesting you talk about the car. I mean, we do laugh about the plight of the horse buggy whip maker, and that seems kind of laughable. On the other hand, cars have been a major source of pollution that has, cut a lot of lives short, honestly, with particulate matter, and are major emitters of greenhouse gases. And those were things that I don't think really anybody really thought about initially, and then it only really became clear after that technology was really locked in. I mean, we depend on cars, and unless you're Amish, going back to a carriage isn't really an option. So I think there are always going to be these sort of unknown unknowns when it comes to technology. And I think we have to be mindful of that, and we have to be sort of monitoring these things as we go along. I don't think that we should stop, exploration of technology, vaccines, antibiotics, and so on. I mean, all these things have helped to make the world a much better place. But on the other hand, we have to bear in mind that there might be something wrong with something we're inventing now that we may not realize till much later. And when you're talking about, the human gene pool, that's pretty serious stuff.
Yeah, I mean, I guess if there's a lesson to be taken from the horse buggy car example, it's that we likely won't know the real challenges to contend with until much later. The ones that we think are going to be the main ones end up actually not being the primary concerns.
Yeah, and it doesn't help in this regard that we humans live a pretty long time, and so what if there are issues with CRISPR and heredity that don't really show up until the next generation or the generation after that? Are you going to wait 40, 50, 80 years to really get a clear sense of how safe things are? It's particularly tricky for humans, but then again, like we can't just say, well, we can't do any medical research for fear that something bad might happen.
There is a connection between CRISPR and genetically modified foods, which is something we've talked about on the program for a long time. I've interviewed George Church here in Boston at Harvard University about the topic. I have sort of catalyzed some anger from many in my audience, a predominantly progressive left-wing audience, because I've taken the position, which I believe is based in science, that there is no evidence that genetically modified foods are harmful to human health on the basis merely of their genetic modification. That if you combine GMOs with harmful pesticides, then yes, those GMOs could be damaging to human health, but because of the pesticides, not because of their genetically modified nature in and of itself. This is something that's connected to the work that you've done. Do you have a strong position generally on the safety of genetically modified foods, specifically on the basis of their being genetically modified?
Well, I think that it's important to bear in mind that every time somebody produces a new batch of seeds, there are some new mutations in them, and that the whole history of domestication has involved you taking advantage of mutations and favoring some over others and combining them through breeding and so on. Now, that being said, nobody ever crossed a corn stalk with a strawberry, so there certainly are limits to that kind of breeding. But on the other hand, if you're concerned about taking genes from one species and putting them into another, then CRISPR is the solution to your problems, really, because CRISPR is basically snipping out small pieces of DNA or changing, like a single letter to a new one in the DNA. It's not putting in these huge changes, and so and in effect in terms of like new mutations that may arise by accident with this process, it's no more than what you get through regular breeding.
The one element of this debate that I see come up time and again is that you will see some detractors of GMO foods say things like, we don't know if it's safe because it hasn't been studied because big agriculture doesn't allow it to be studied. In my research, that seems to be patently untrue. In other words, that while big agriculture may not be funding those studies, or at least the unbiased studies that we would hope to see, that the academic world has actually been studying GMO food for a long time, and there seem to be countless studies about it.
Oh, sure, of course. I mean, go to Cornell University, go to University of Minnesota, go to University of California, Davis. You'll find tons of research on this. I mean, in my book, She Has Her Mother's Laugh, I went to Cold Spring Harbor Laboratory and spent time with a scientist there who is using CRISPR to try to produce tomatoes that can grow further north and by extending their growing season. And it's all he is doing is he's snipping out small chunks of DNA that are involved in controlling when they flower. So yeah, I mean it's not something that is CRISPR is not something that's being hidden in some corporate lab. Now, but I don't want to make it sound like everything is totally perfect in advance.
Sure.
I mean, we do have an issue right now with with herbicides, as you mentioned. I mean, the one of the main herbicides that is being used with these GM crops is starting to become useless because evolution has basically bred resistant weeds. That happened before with regular pesticides and regular crops. Now it's happening again. And so now some of the big companies are moving to another herbicide, that dicamba, which is a lot of scientists have a lot of serious concerns about the use of it. So, the GMOs, I don't see them as being some kind of monster, but they're certainly not a panacea. And if GM crops mean that we end up using some herbicides that are of serious health concerns, then that's not really a great solution.
We've been speaking with Carl Zimmer, who's a columnist for the New York Times, most recently author of She Has Her Mother's Laugh, The Power, Perversions, and Potential of Heredity, which I highly recommend. Carl, really a pleasure speaking with you today.
Thanks so much for having me. Take care.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
This might come as a shock to you, but Vice President Mike Pence said that the president should resign over his lies about his adultery. Truly shocking revelation, except he didn't say it about the current president. When I mean that Mike Pence said the president should resign over his lies related to infidelity, he was talking about Bill Clinton at the time. Apparently, when it's Trump, it no longer matters. And this is the same Mike Pence who's so pious and so moral and so Christian, such a good Christian, that he won't have dinner alone with another woman. It needs to have a chaperone there. And there's been a bunch of old columns by Pence that have come to light. And of course, he's talking about Bill Clinton here, but wouldn't it apply 5 times more to Donald Trump? Pence wrote, who knows what year, "If you fall and I fall into bad moral habits, we can harm our families, our employers, and our friends. The president of the United States can incinerate the planet. Seriously, the very idea that we ought to have at or less than the same moral demands placed on the chief executive that we place on our next door neighbor is ludicrous and dangerous. Throughout our history, we have seen the presidency as the repository of all our highest hopes and ideals and values. To demand less is to do an injustice to the blood that bought our freedoms." And then the gold mine calling for the resignation of the president for lying about adultery. Not this president, the previous president, of course, saying our leaders must either act to restore the luster and dignity of the institution of the presidency, or we can be certain that this is only the beginning of an even more difficult time for our land. For the nation to move on, the president must move out. He's also on audio-visual recordings saying very similar things. Take a look at this.
Is adultery no longer a big deal in Indiana and in America? I'd just love to know your thoughts, because I, for one, believe that the 7th commandment contained in the 10 commandments is still a big deal. It's the most important promise you'll ever make. And holding people accountable to those promises and holding people accountable to respecting the promises that other people make, to me, what could possibly be a bigger deal than that in this country?
If only he would hold the current president to that standard. And I point this out not to actually have a conversation about hypocrisy, but to point out that it's all BS. What I mean is political positions, public personas, political issues, making something a big deal or not a big deal. This is all cover for what we've seen happen bigger picture in the United States for the last 30 to 40 years, which is that corporations increasingly control government and our lives. And this is sort of the other side to the Trump fiasco. On the one hand, we have to report on the day-to-day of the Trump administration, the hypocrisy from everyone around him, like Mike Pence in this clip, the lies, the corruption with Russia, the possible obstruction of justice and crimes. It's all real and it's all happening. But the backdrop is that behind the micro of the political theater is that the Trump administration didn't just appear out of nowhere. We have a very flawed democracy, and I don't mean just like how we count votes, first past the post voting. I mean, our political system for decades has been dominated by the false dichotomy of Democrat versus Republican, when it's been two parties that allowed corporate power to build where the individual now barely counts. And yes, all the time. I tell you, Democrats and Republicans are different on many issues. What the minimum wage should be, net neutrality, important differences, and we've got to vote the current regime out in November. But elected officials from both parties for decades stand aside. They benefit from the status quo. No one gets the corporate and dark money out of politics. And I question, of course, whether any of them want to, since the status quo got them elected. And then the majority of the political debate is playing to the narrow debate where there's no real questioning of the systems that got us here at large. Campaign finance, yes, that is a meta questioning of the system, and people are doing it. Some people are doing it, but not in a way where the protests and the civil disobedience are actually going to change what's going on. How did Trump win the Republican primary? Okay, that's an important question. Do his supporters realize that they've been bamboozled? Maybe they do, maybe they don't. It matters. But the big issue is how corporate power has subjugated both Democrats and Republicans. None of that would have changed whether it's Hillary or Trump. Major consequences between Hillary versus Trump. Which wars will be started? How many lives will Trump ruin? But the status quo pushes ahead, and this Pence hypocrisy about resignation based on lying about infidelity, it's just another data point that it is all political posturing. 95% of what we hear from our elected officials on both sides is political posturing. We've interviewed Fox News moles before. We interviewed Joe Muto on the show, really good interview that we're linking to on YouTube. We've interviewed Fox News employees before, David Schuster, linking to that interview on YouTube, excellent interview. And as you might know, I was recently on Fox News along with right-wing radio host Dom Giordano, and we were hosted in a sort of debate by Leland Vittert. And as some of you know, it very quickly became 2 against 1 when I appeared on Fox News. I have now received an email from someone claiming to be a low-level person at the weekend Fox News show that I was on. It's called America's News Headquarters, who says that immediately after I appeared on Fox News, it was said that I would never be invited back after that appearance. This is the email I received, okay? You are going to now have all the information that I have. Hey, David, I'm writing to you from a throwaway email account because I don't want to be identified. I am a very low-level person who is at Fox News during their daytime weekend shows. I was there when you were on. After the appearance, I heard a conversation between producers who say you aren't ever going to be back on Fox News. It wasn't clear why. It wasn't a long conversation, but it was clear they did not like your, so they used the wrong your, I'm including that in the transcript. They didn't like your appearance and said he isn't ever coming back. Keep up the good work. So I have no way of verifying this, right? I have no way to know whether this is true. I know I haven't been invited back, but it's only been a couple of weeks. I don't think it's reasonable to assume I would have already been back.
Right.
I also don't know why I'd be blacklisted as a result of that appearance. I mean, for people who say, David, you owned them, it was a very reasonable, within the bounds of what Fox News expects segment. It's not like I did such damage to the conservative brand. Obviously, I didn't. And I would argue that even Kyle Kulinski, who was on a few months ago, did just as well as I did. He was recently back on, so I don't know who, I don't know the truth of who this person is and if they actually heard this conversation. If true, it's utterly and completely insane.
I think Kyle did well the first time, but he did much better, and I think he would even say this the second time around. So that makes me question whether or not Fox News would have him back on for a third time.
Sure.
I also thought you did really well. And, these Fox News types, the producers, they just want these weak liberals on who will push over and,
I get it.
Credit Trump, engage in the argument, but clearly not perform very well. Well, they want the Juan Williams types.
Yeah, well, I am certainly no Juan Williams, that's for sure. But I was thinking, imagine if they didn't like how white I looked on camera, which of course was because of their lighting. Like that would be absolutely and totally insane. But if anybody has more information, I would love to hear more. And quite frankly, I don't think they even think about me enough to think about blacklisting me. They would just not invite me back, right? Like blacklists exist. I've talked to Mike Papantonio about being blacklisted at certain networks. I've talked to Sam Cedar about blacklists. I just don't think 1 8-minute appearance that I did that wasn't even that remarkable is enough to get them to care enough to blacklist me.
Yeah, and I really wonder, the person who wrote you this email, are they some closeted liberal over there at Fox News?
They said keep up the good work.
Yeah, I mean, why are they working for Fox News then?
We know that Fox News, which I believe does use a lot of union tech people, like camera people, a lot of them are left-wingers. This is, again, what Joe Muto told us, the Fox News mole, and what I think David Schuster, I don't remember if on air or off air, talk to me about. So I don't know exactly what the position is of this person. I'd love to know more, and hopefully there will be some follow-up. But at this point, I have not seen any definitive evidence that I have been blacklisted from Fox News. It would be somewhat of an accomplishment to get myself blacklisted after just one live appearance, right? Like, that would be interesting.
I mean, it would be better if you went out with a bang, though, like insulted their entire news headquarters.
If I suspected that I was maybe at risk of being blacklisted, I would have gone in and tried to burn the entire place down, figuratively, of course, in criticizing the mere existence of Fox News. We received a very, very angry voicemail at 219-2-DAVID-P over the weekend, and I don't think it needs much of an introduction. I'll just play it for you.
You un-American, why don't you and your little sidekick go back to Argentina or wherever the hell you belong? This country gave you the right to be on TV. I just turned it on and I turned it off. You people are jerks. Get rid of the Pledge of Allegiance. Why don't you get rid of you and, you know what? Your mother likes to suck quay. You know what quay is? You un-American. You know, we should run you out, you alien, and that other little flake, little fairy boy that sits there with you. You two, would he play with each other?
Incisive critique. Why would Pat go back to Argentina? Like, you've never even been to Argentina. Never mind. You're obviously not from Argentina. You've never even been. How would you? What legal basis would there be for sending you to Argentina?
I'd love to go to Argentina. I may actually take this caller under advisement.
This is what we're dealing with. This is what we're up against. Okay, and we're not sugarcoating it. I'm not presenting it as more than it is, but I am letting you. That's the full unedited scope of it. There were two more that came immediately after that, by the way, which contained language which was not okay for FCC broadcasting, but maybe we're thinking of a new rejected voicemail segment on Instagram at David Pakman Show. So maybe we would use it there. This is what we're up against, and this is why I'm telling you that it is much more effective to go out and get people to vote. We have 50% voter turnout. You can convince 5 people. I would argue you can convince 50 people to vote before you're going to change the minds of someone like this guy. And that's why that's where the focus needs to be for 2018, for 2020, and so on and so forth. We have a fantastic bonus show today. Omarosa tells NPR that she has heard the Trump N-word tapes. We're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about her leaking or publishing the tape that she made of John Kelly firing her from the White House. It is compelling. I listened to it just a little while ago. We will talk about the Trump administration planning to overhaul a program that's designed to save Medicare money. Why would they want to do that? Why wouldn't they want to save Medicare money? I think we can probably guess why. And lastly, Congressman Keith Ellison is denying domestic abuse accusations. We will also talk about that on today's bonus show. Get the bonus show, support the David Pakman Show, become a patron at patreon.com/David Pakman Show, or sign up for membership at www.joinpakman.com.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.